Hello, and welcome to week one of human sexuality. This week, we are going to be talking about um, sexuality in terms of how it's viewed in the United States, and then talk about some of the research methods used to study human sexuality. As such, let's start talking about this week's assignments. This week, you have a scavenger hunt due, your SmartBook chapters 1 and 2, ethics in research, and that's also in the McGraw-Hill book. You have your sexual researchers worksheet, discussing sex blog, chapter 1 and 2 quiz, and your discussion board post. Now, I know this may seem overwhelming and maybe daunting, but many of these assignments are very quick. For example, discussing sex blog. All it is a paragraph just talking about why it's difficult to talk about sex. So please don't give up. This is an 8-week course. It'll go by very quickly, and I know you can do it. So this week we are covering chapters 1 and 2. So I'll first start this with chapter 1. And the main topics will be studying human sexuality, sexuality, popular culture, and the media, sexuality across cultures and times, and then some of the societal norms and sexuality. So our idea of sexuality is really shaped by popular culture and our media. Generally, adults spend more time engaging with media than in any other activity. Media helps tell us what behaviors are appropriate. And think about sexual behaviors. Media is what tells us what sexual behaviors are appropriate and who can we engage in these behaviors with and why are they appropriate. In addition, aspects that are of sexuality that are not portrayed in the media may also be just as important as what is portrayed in the media. And then here we have our media's portrayal of sex. And so understanding that the media's prominence is really essential to helping get our own ideas about sexuality and how we are influenced. So think about all the different avenues for media. We have the internet, the music industry, magazines, tabloids, books, men and women's magazines, and just the advertising and all of those forms of media. This often leads to something called self-objectification, which is evaluating yourself based on appearance only. And as you can see from this image here, this top row is sexual objectification. And so we tend to base it on physical appearance, how sexually attractive a person is, and how well they maintain their image. And people are not valued for this bottom row where we talk about personality. What are their abilities and what is their individuality? Another concept when we think about media's portrayal of sex is sexualization, which is a form of sexism that's really narrow, and it frames the person's worth and value based on their sexual aspects. Here is a chart of the average time spent per day with media by persons in the United States ages 18 and over. So what this is telling you is every day people spend on average 12 hours on media. And adults age 18 and over spend more time engaging with media than in any other activity in life. So this is a lot. We are definitely influenced by media because we are so engaged with it on a daily basis. And we look at television and digital media. So while TV and digital viewing has been increasing, so has the number of sexual references and programming. Sexual images are often the dominant way that young people learn about sex, is learning through what they see on digital media and television. The FDA, which is the Federal Communications Commission, has set standards on what is appropriate, but it's not very clear on what these standards are. What constitutes art versus what constitutes sexual imagery. And in addition, the decency standards are looser between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. But I also think about what is available via digital media or the internet, and there are no decency standards. So it's really everything goes here. And it's important to realize that when we are placing digital devices, phones, tablets into the hands of younger people who may not be able to discern between what is true and what is not true. In addition to TV and digital TV shows, we have music and video games. So music videos play to the ear and the eye. So they're making it look as appealing and oftentimes just trying to get attention. So this first image on the top is that WAP song, and you can see here the imagery is very suggestive. At the same time, video games also promote sexist and violent attitudes towards women. Men are often shown as these unrealistic, violent, strong people. Women are oftentimes victimized. And so it makes me think of Grand Theft Auto, where women were victimized as prostitutes. It was encouraged to be violent against women. And so all of these help shape our view on sex and sexuality. When we think about feature-length films and movies, they're also similar to TV in terms of what is portrayed, but they often don't show a lot of the consequences of unprotected sex. Very rarely do you see in movies and film one of the actors or actresses getting chlamydia after having unprotected sex with their partner. So it's often unrealistic. Another problem with movies and film is the love that is shown in those dramas are often very unrealistic. It's very romanticized and doesn't really portray what love is. And one of the outcomes of this is among young adults, increased movie viewing correlates with these idealized expectations about romance and intimacy, and they're not always accurate images of romance and intimacy. And so this becomes a problem when later in relationships or entering relationships, when the relationship doesn't follow what movies are telling us it should follow, which leads to expectations not to be met, and it leads to disappointment. Another issue with film is the notion of LGBTQIA and how they are utilized in film, and then how are they portrayed in film. So oftentimes when there are people in the LGBTQIA community, it is defined, their role is defined by their sexual orientation. So if it's someone being gay or lesbian, their role is very narrowly defined as a gay or a lesbian actor or actress. Gay and lesbian women are often stereotyped in movies, which does not help the cause. Good news is that coming out stories are increasingly dealing with younger characters to show that younger people are coming out. And there has been an effort to incorporate more LGBTQIA, which I should have mentioned. That's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, and intersex. So they are being slowly more integrated into mainstream video and television. An example is of the 44 films that were released in 2020. Now I realize 2020 was the year of the pandemic, so this number is greatly reduced. But of those, 22% included LGBTQIA characters, which is a 4% increase from 2019. And even though there were fewer LGBTQIA characters overall, it was 20 in 2020 and it was 50 in 2019. But the organization attributed that steep decline just due to the coronavirus and not necessarily a shift in attitudes. 40% of the LGBTQIA characters in 2020 were people of color, which is again is a new, it, is newly is becoming more common, which is a good thing, and that's an increase of 6% from the past year. Oftentimes, there is something called queer baiting, which is when the media where the creators use homoeroticism to lure same-sex and liberal audiences, but never really include actual homosexual sexual behavior in the film. So it's all like a taste. Here's what you may see, but then when it comes down to it, they do not show anything. Online social networks. So the internet has really changed the way we communicate and carry on personal relationships and interpersonal relationships. Oftentimes, we can easily obtain and distribute sexual information. There are social networking sites. They provide opportunities to display different identities, including sexual orientation. And it also helps find like-minded individuals who share the same characteristics, including gender identity, sexual orientation, and other things as well. The internet culture helps contribute to shaping our sexual culture. And perhaps the reason why we see more representation of people identifying as LGBTQIA is perhaps because they have found these networking groups on social media, so they don't feel so alone or isolated, or that no one else has the same feelings as them, which makes it more easy or easier to come out. In addition to online social networks, we have online dating sites. There's a lot of sexual health sites, which is good and bad because some of these sites do contain misinformation or bad information. In addition, these online social networks, there has been an increase in porn consumption, and addiction to pornography. A little bit more about online social networks. So there's also sexting, which is sending or receiving suggestive or explicit texts, photos, or video messages. Particularly for those in high school or younger, this can be implicated in child pornography. So if you take a picture of yourself and you are under the age of 17 and you're distributing those pictures around, not only do you have child pornography on your media device, but you're also distributing it. And there are some serious consequences that go along with that. In addition, there can be trafficking. It can hurt one's reputation, career, self-esteem, and relationships. And high levels of media use or social media use has health consequences. It is not healthy to be on social media at all times, comparing yourself to friends, to celebrities, and communicating in that manner. Among the younger population, social networking has been associated with academic problems, sleep deprivation, obesity, and an increase in risky behaviors. Privacy is of increasing concern. I feel that as social networking increases, levels of privacy decreases. And I'm not saying social networking is always bad. There are numerous purposes to social networking, and one is including your sexual self-expression and feeling safe expressing your sexual self, experimenting with different personas, personalities, identities, self-definition, and education. So this brings us a little to sexual orientation and some words that are used to express that. Homosexuality is expressing emotional and sexual attraction to individuals of the same sex or gender. Commonly called gay, some identify as queer or lesbian. And this has been throughout history. Among the ancient Greeks, same-sex relationships between men represented the highest form of love. Now, even though the men came home to wives and still had sex with wives, it was truly that love relationship between men that was considered the highest form. Among Sambian males of New Guinea, sexual orientation is very malleable. And so it changes as a person ages and goes through different stages of life. And then we have bisexuality, which is having an emotional and sexual attraction to both men and women. and asexuality, which is having low, little, or no sexual attraction to anyone. Now, gender has been a term that has been in the media very often now, and it causes a lot of confusion for some people. So I hope that this will help clear it up a little bit. And so, biology and sex is man and woman. And this is based on how you were born. It's based on chromosomes. XX is women, XY is men. It's based on the hormonal influences. So women have estrogen and progesterone, and it influences the brain development and structure and function. Men have predominantly testosterone, and that influences their brain development. And so, generally, when you see the term man and woman in text, it is referring to this biological notion of sex. What are the chromosomes? It's the chromosome, the hormones, and then those influences on the brain and body. But then we also have gender, and gender is a socially constructed notion of how one feels, and it's generally termed as masculine and feminine. And then transgender is the gender expression or identity that's not congruent with the sex assigned at birth. Now, when we talk about sex assigned at birth, that generally refers to a biological aspect of sex, man and woman. I have a problem with using the term sex assigned at birth because the assignment of sex at birth is just a visual. So it's looking at the baby and saying, is there a penis or vagina, and identifying it that way. Now, there are cases where the external genitalia may look a certain way, but it may not actually be it. And so when I refer to biological sex, I am not talking about the presence of a penis or vagina. I am talking about XX or XY. I'm talking about hormones. So woman would be progesterone and estrogen. Male would be testosterone. And then if we're going to talk about genitalia, I would be referring to males having testicles, which contains the sex cells, and females or women having ovaries, which again are the sex cells. It's not necessarily penis, vagina, it's ovary and testes, and those are the sexual organs that are associated with biological sex. And again, this is not a new concept. In Native American tradition, they had a term called a two-spirit, and it was a cross-gender person. And they express gender in how we dress, our work roles, but not necessarily sexual behavior. So sex and gender are completely different. There's also in South Asian society called a hijra, and a third gender among the Zuni of New Mexico. And in some non-Western cultures, androphilic males are attracted to and aroused by adult males and are often assumed roles within women. Gynephilia is a sexual attraction to or arousal by adult females. And so we talk about then societal norms and sexuality. And normal, as you can see from this image, normal is an illusion. What is normal for the spider is chaos for the fly. Normal is just a perception. Now, in society, we learn well cultural roles become natural part of our personality and seem to be instinctive, meaning it's part of our instinct. But we often use to imply healthy or moral to this idea of normal. And it's really difficult to establish what is natural or unnatural, what is normal or not normal. Normal sexual behavior generally is defined as behavior that conforms to a group's average or median or a pattern of behavior. And so normal doesn't necessarily mean biologically normal. It just means that on average, this is what people do. Stereotypes, media images, religious teaching, customs, and cultural norms don't tell us much about how people actually behave. And across cultures all over the world, reproduction is one view of normal sexual behavior that's agreed upon by most cultures. And again, this is probably to perpetuate humans so that humans continue to live and thrive, which is done by making babies. So, as such, there are many variations in sexual behavior. Researchers view human sexuality as characterized by sexual variation, which is sexual variety and diversity. And the best way to understand this diversity is on a continuum where sexual activities range from I always do this to I would never do this. But we tend to think of activities as deviant or abnormal and normal. But even these activities that are labeled deviant or abnormal are oftentimes engaged by some of us or most of us to some degree. Exhibitionism, voyeurism, which is watching, having a fetish. So even though these are termed abnormal, they tend to be more normal than we generally think of. And then there's also no definite standards for evaluating sexual behaviors. There's not a checklist, there's not a survey to tell us whether or not we're engaging in normal or abnormal behavior. Now, many sexual behaviors are harmful to ourselves or to others. And these are behaviors that tend to be labeled as deviant, abnormal, and oftentimes illegal. So, harmful to oneself is masturbating asphyxia, which is choking yourself while masturbating. And then to others would be rape, child molestation, obscene phone calls. So, infringing on the rights of others. Current psychological standards for determining how harmful a behavior is centers around issues of coercion, potential harm to yourself or others, and then creating personal distress. This is going to lead us to chapter 2. And this chapter is talking about sex, advice columnist, pop psychology, how we think objectively about sexuality, some of the common sex research methods, sex researchers, although I'm not going to be lecturing about that because there is an assignment this week that you'll be researching sex researchers, and then some contemporary research studies. And so oftentimes people look to sex advice or advice columns in media for information about sex. The purpose of these is to inform, but more often is to entertain in a simplified manner. This also happens to be a major source of information for college students, and there often is a sex column in student-run newspapers, but these tend to be controversial. They tend to portray some inaccurate information and tend to focus on the abnormal or sensationalized stories, not what's going on day-to-day life. The image here I have is of Dr. Ruth, who was a physician and specialized in providing sexual education. Now, her columns were based on science and fact, not opinion and not sensualization. But I think the problem is we tend to look at these columns and see it as advice as factual. And so here I have 2 magazines, Cosmopolitan and Men's Health. And if you ever look at different magazines at the grocery store, you will always see headings like 20 of the best ways to have sex. And Cosmopolitan, 75 sex moves men crave. These are not based on fact. They're not based in science. The purpose of these magazines is really for financial gain. And so they try to get these big headlines to get you interested in learning more about what they have to say. Other problems is they tend to be focused on heterosexual behavior only. And again, these are not based on scholarly research. They're based on stuff that have been found on the internet. There's also media tends to use and abuse what is found in research. So to reinforce their authority, the media will incorporate statistics from a study's finding. And they'll say, oh, in such and such study, here's what they found. The problem with it is at first, They oversimplify what the study is, and they don't give enough background information on the study. Second is that just because one study found a certain result doesn't mean that it's always true. It means the studies need to be replicated over and over again to see if people will find the same result. Generally, in describing social science research, the media oversimplifies it and distorts the information. And so, oftentimes, if you find one study that says dogs are not aggressive, you will find another study that says dogs are aggressive. But yet, when the media reports on something, it'll find the sensationalized one, dogs are aggressive, and report on that without reporting on the other side of the issue. It's also really important, but very difficult to think objectively about sexuality. Not what we think about it, but what it actually is. And so objectivity is the observation of things as they exist. And as you can see from the image, it's a tree. So the object reality is a tree. But one person says it's a tree. One person says it's an apple tree. One person says it's a money tree. They're not wrong. That's their interpretation of what they're seeing, but that's not the objective interpretation. The one boy has it right. It's a tree. It's also difficult to keep your own value judgments out of research. And so examining sex objectively is difficult because sex has been defined in moral terms, in religious terms, in cultural terms, political terms. And it's hard to take out value judgments when conducting research. So value judgments are based on moral or ethical standards, not objective standards. So if you see the two images above the people, the one on the left says these are oranges. That is an objective statement. Those are oranges. But the second person says, I love oranges. That's a value statement. Then there's also opinions, biases, and stereotypes. An opinion is an unsubstantiated belief or concern or conclusion, and it's often reflective of our personal values or biases. A bias is a personal learning or inclination that reflects a prejudice in favor of or against a person or group, or another thing in contrast to another. Some common sexual stereotypes are men are always ready for sex. Nice women are not interested in sex. Women need a reason for sex. Men need a place. Virgins are uptight and asexual. Relationships of gay men never last. And lesbian women hate men. These are stereotypes, which are simplistic, rigidly held, overgeneralized beliefs, and they're often negative. And stereotypes are a type of schema. And a schema is a psychological theory that is a learning theory, and it highlights one way that we learn. And it's a way that we use to make sense of the information we receive. And it's how we organize information. So it's derived from past experiences, current knowledge, social information, and schemas help provide guidance in current behavior. So for example, in this image, on the left, the girl is playing with a dog and says dog. So she knows that's a dog. And in her head, she's kind of created this box of what a dog is. In the second picture, she points to a cat. She says dog, because in her mind, that's what she knows. That's her past experience with an animal. And then the right picture, now it's being explained. Dogs are dogs, cats are cats. Here's what makes the differences. So now her schemas are two. Now she has one schema for dogs and one for cats. And there's also a problem with common fallacies, egocentric and ethnocentric thinking. So fallacy is an error in reasoning, and it affects our understanding of a subject. So look at the fallacy here. And this is the tiger and the cat. The fallacy, tigers and lions are ruthless killers. Because house cats are part of that family, they must be ruthless killers, right? That's a fallacy. It's an error in reasoning. The reasoning makes sense, right? Because they're part of the same cat family, but that's not true. So there's an error in the reasoning. An egocentric fallacy is a mistaken belief that our personal experience and our values are held by others. So if I say it's true, you should say it's true. Ethnocentric fallacy or ethnocentrism is a belief that our own group or culture is innately superior to others. And so in the image on the left, you can see a person wearing a head covering and then the westernized woman pulling it off saying, hey, I got you, we're free, I'll free you. Making the assumption that the headscarf is somehow not freeing. And so it's also making the assumption that being without a headscarf is better. And so ethnocentric fallacy results often when we stereotype other cultures as primitive, innocent, inferior, or not as advanced. There's also a variety of sex research methods. And so they do follow the scientific method, which is form a hypothesis, test it, and then come up with some conclusions. Oftentimes, sex research relies on induction, so it's drawing conclusions from specific facts. And again, even though these are following science-based principles, induction, it's your opinion, it's your perception. So of course, it could be wrong. Sex researchers or sexologists use the same methodology as other social science, but they're often constrained by different ethical concerns and taboos. And then the methodological approaches include clinical research, survey research, observational research, and experimental research. One of the ethical concerns, and this is for all social sciences, but is informed consent. And that is full disclosure to an individual about the purpose of the study, the potential risks, and benefits of participating in this research study. And participants have a right to withdraw without penalty. They're guaranteed anonymity or confidentiality and are entitled protection from harm. And these are very strict, and they've been in place because in the past, researchers were not so ethical. For example, in the 1960s, there was a study called the Tea Room Trade Study, and it was conducted by Laud Humphreys, who was a sociologist. He was a PhD student, and he was conducting a study to look at behaviors of men who have sex with men. And so what he did is he went into a public restroom and he observed men having sex with men in these restrooms. He concealed his identity as a researcher, and he wrote down the license plate numbers of the people who came in the bathroom to have sex, and then later went to the homes of those participants pretending to be conducting a general health study. This is a huge invasion of privacy for the identity of the people. And he also concealed himself and did identify himself as a researcher. Around the same time, but for a longer period of time, from 1932 to 1974, so 40 years, there was the Public Health Tuskegee study. And this was a study of untreated syphilis in Black men. It was government funded. It occurred in Macon County, Alabama. And they were looking at what happened when syphilis was left untreated. And just to give you a heads up, it would increase disability and early death. They already knew that. And so at this time, they recruited Black men only. And they tested the men for syphilis, never told them whether or not they had it or not. And they waited to see how the disease progressed. Now, in the beginning of this study, in the 1930s, there was no cure or treatment for syphilis. So perhaps at that time, you didn't see a lot of ethical issues. However, in the middle of this study, antibiotics became discovered, and penicillin, and those were treatments for syphilis. And they withheld the treatment from these infected men. Another concern is sampling. And so there are different ways to get a sample of a population. Random samples are a sample conducted in an unbiased way, and everyone has the same chance of getting selected. Random samples generally are pretty good ways to get an idea of what the population is. A representative sample is a small group representing the larger group in terms of age, sex, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and so on. And so it's purposeful selecting people from a group so that every ensures that there is more representation from groups. And then there's a bias samples, which are samples that are not representative of larger groups. So for example, let's look at this picture below. On the left, that would be a biased sample, right? Everyone has a red shirt, same hairdo, same, skin color, everything. Unrepresented. Cannot say what came from that study can be applied to the general population. In the middle, it's still unrepresentative, right? Because there isn't any diversity. There's still more people, men wearing the yellow shirt. There's still more girls wearing the blue shirt. But on the right side, here you have a representative sample because now you have people representing different cultures. In clinical research, this is an in-depth examination of either an individual or a group seeking help with some sort of psychological, medical problem or disorder. It tends to be very descriptive. Inferences or cause cannot be drawn from this type of research. It's specific on a case study, on a person or a group of people with the same problem. And so the major limitation is that the emphasis is on a pathological behavior or an unhealthy or diseased behavior. So we're not looking at healthy behavior. We're not looking at common behavior. This is pathological behavior. Survey research is great because you can reach a lot of people. It's using questionnaires or interviews to gather information. It's fast, it's relatively inexpensive. However, people can be poor reporters of their own sexual behavior. Maybe they're going to write down what they wish they were doing, not what they're actually doing. But it's a good way to get a lot of results, a lot of surveys out, and generally in a pretty quick amount of time. And then observational research. This is where the researcher observes a group of people or a person. They make notes about behaviors without trying to manipulate them. And so in the tea room study, that would have been an observational research. So there are serious ethical issues because how do you observe sexual behavior without participants' knowledge or consent? In addition, we tend to act differently when we know someone is observing us. And so if we are aware that we are being observed, we act differently. And so as you can see from this image, the purpose is you want to be able to observe without people knowing so they continue to act normal. And so it tends to be very difficult. Experimental research is when there is an experiment and you have variables, independent variables, dependent variables. And so in this example, I just wanted to show what the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable were. An independent variable is what are you changing? So in this example, they're changing the amount of water they're giving the plant. So the independent variable is what you are going to change to see what the impact is. The dependent variable is the variable that's going to be affected by the change. So in this example, the dependent variable is the plant. What's the size of the plant? How many leaves does the plant have? Is it alive or is it dead? And it's dependent on how much water it's getting. So water is the independent variable. The other type are correlational studies. They measure two or more variables to see if they're related. A little bit more about experimental research. And so a lot of experimental research depends on the physical response as it relates to sex or sexual arousal, which is kind of difficult. So there's plasmographs, and these are devices that attach to genitals to measure physiological responses. However, think about it. If you were going to give your time to do a study, you're not getting paid for it, and then they say, hey, we're going to put this device in your vagina or wrap it around your penis to see how you physically respond to a video. A lot of people are going to say, no, thank you. And so This is where we talk about the representative sample. It is hard to get a representative sample for these types of studies because a certain person is willing to do this. Not everyone would be willing to do this. Not everyone would be willing to perform in front of someone taking notes. So they don't, okay, so in addition to bias and the study sample, these devices don't necessarily assess sexual desire or arousal. Just because your body acts a certain way doesn't necessarily mean your mind is following it. And then sex researchers. So once the domain of religion went through, Western sexuality is now studied using the scientific framework. Research reviews, nonetheless, obviously have intertwined with beliefs and values of their time. Three themes are evident in the work of those who are regarded as modern researchers or sexual enthusiasts. The belief that sexual expression is essential to being well, the ability to seek to broaden the range of legitimate sexual activity, including homosexuality, and the belief that female sexuality is equal to that of male sexuality. Like I said, I'm not going to go over the specific sexual researchers. It's going to be in the text as well as there is an assignment this week on it. But there are contemporary research studies. One is the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, which is conducted biannually, and it measures the prevalence of 6 different categories of health. The report for 2015 provides the first national estimates of the percentage of high school students who self-identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or who are not sure of their sexual identity, and who've had sexual contact with only the same sex or with both sexes. Just to give you a little perspective, between 2015 and 2019, the percentage of 15 to 17-year-olds who said they identified as non-heterosexual rose from 8 to 11%. In addition to this overall increase, percentage of boys who identified as non-heterosexual rose from 4.5 to 5.7%, where girls had the greater increase from 12% to 17.8% of girls who identified as non-heterosexual. And then there's the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior that's conducted in 2010. So it's a little older, but this was the most expansive nationally represented study of sexual and sexual health behaviors. It provided a needed and valued update of America's sexual behavior. And it also shows an increase in bisexual diversity. Throughout this text, you'll see different statistics highlighted about the results from the study. The data had information on masturbation, oral sex, vaginal intercourse, and anal intercourse. It also categorized them by age ranges. The problem with the study, though, is that it's already over 10 years old. And so I think it needs to be conducted again to see where have things shifted. And then there's the National College Health Assessment. It was last done in 2016. It's conducted every spring and fall. And this one assesses students' health behavior, college health behavior, and their perceptions of the prevalence of these behaviors amongst their peers. This concludes our PowerPoint for this week. I hope you have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions or concerns.